by a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, Louis Napoleon, who styled himself Napoleon III. This was a time in Europe when the nations, the great nations, were more or less constantly fighting with each other to try to take territory away from each other. And they were also scrambling to take over Africa and South Asia at the time. So grabbing a slice of America didn't seem too far out of line.
Oh, nice.
So the Mexican conservatives entered into a conspiracy with the French imperialists to make Mexico a satellite state, a French satellite state. Napoleon declared that his mission was the regeneration of chaotic Mexico. Although I think maybe laying hands on the silver mines may have been more important to him than altruism. There were some debt issues that gave Napoleon an excuse to invade. The Vatican supported the measure. They wanted to roll back the anti-clerical reform laws that had been put in place. And he also had the support of several Catholic monarchs in Europe. The third factor that made this possible was the fact that the United States was deeply involved in the Civil War and were careful not to do anything that would encourage a European power to side with the Southern Rebellion. So unfortunately, the United States was at this time not able to help the legitimate Juarez government. So he was on his own. Well, the French invasion began in late 1861, and the Mexicans actually defeated the French invaders in one of the first big battles, the first Battle of Puebla, on May 5th, 1862, a date which is, of course, today celebrated mostly in bars across the United States as Cinco de Mayo. But the invaders recovered and advanced on Mexico City and displaced the legitimate Juarez government. With the French advance, the imperialists in Europe set about lining up a figurehead emperor who could head up the nominal government in French-controlled Mexico. This is the group of conservative Mexicans, the Junta de Notables in Europe, and our friend, our friend Gutierrez is right here in the front row. They identified an unemployed member of the vast Habsburg dynasty who seemed like a likely candidate, and that was Ferdinand Maximilian Joseph Maria Habsburg-Lothringen, who's the younger brother of the Emperor of Austria, Franz Joseph, excuse me. Maximilian was a fair, good-natured, tall, adventurous, dignified man, charming, honest, and well-intentioned. A good resume. But contemporaries described him as naive, indecisive, lacking focus, impulsive, and easily influenced by unqualified flatterers. But he was a direct descendant, if only through the female line, of the great Spanish king during the golden age of the conquistadors, Charles V. He was doubtless an intelligent man. Different references say that he spoke between 7 and 10 languages, useful in the polyglot Austrian Empire. He had a career heading the Austrian Navy, had a strong interest in botany, and he married his second cousin, Marie Charlotte Amélie Augustine Victoire Clémentine Léopoldine, the daughter of the Belgian king She was from a German royal family, the Saxe-Coburg family, which also, by the way, served up Prince Albert, who was Queen Victoria's consort. So everybody was related, I guess, in these days. Charlotte was described as well-liked, although she had a reserved personality. She was, contemporaries said she was impressively regal rather than beautiful, although the portrait painters make her look pretty good, I think. She was a practical, business-like woman, good with finance, certainly more vigorous and more focused than Maximilian. Historians now think she may have been mildly bipolar, with periods of vigorous activity followed by times of depression. Charlotte spoke French, German, English, and Italian, but apparently not Flemish, kind of strange for a Belgian princess. When they were together, Charlotte and Maximilian proposed to speak German with each other. They were married on July 27, 1857, when Charlotte was 17 years old. This is a photograph of the happy couple. They look kind of morose to me. Can we stop? Can we move that down a little? It looks like we're cutting off the top of the image. Anyway, we'll see. Oh, how did they that go away? No. Oh. I don't know how to make that go away. Anyway, the Junta de Notables met with Maximilian in October 1863 at his palace outside of Trieste. And again, we see our friend Gutierrez there in the front row reading the proposal to him, inviting Maximilian to become Emperor of Mexico. Maximilian was indecisive. After 2.5 years of fighting, Mexico City then finally fell to the French invaders with help from Belgian, Austrian troops and some conservative Mexican generals. Maximilian was still dithering about whether to take the job or not. He had a bout of deep depression and took to bed for some days trying to decide. But what did it? I think Charlotte had a deep influence on Maximilian. And she really liked the idea of being an empress. That would make her the equal of her friend and mentor, Empress Eugenie of France, and her sister-in-law, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, whom she quite disliked. So she convinced Maximilian and the Mexican conservatives, finally convinced him that the Mexican people really wanted him to be their emperor, and he decided to take the job. The French set up an imperial government in Mexico City as kind of a placeholder until Maximilian could be brought over and installed in the job. They appointed a regent, and he was Juan Almonte, quite an interesting historical figure. He had a military career and he was a diplomat. He was with Santa Anna, Battle of the Alamo in the Texas Revolution, and he was ambassador to the United States, among other countries. He was also, interestingly enough, the son of this man who you may know, Jose Maria Morelos, the Catholic priest who was one of the early leaders in the fight for Mexican independence. Well, moving back to the Yucatan Peninsula, the people here had mostly been ignoring the French fighting that had been going on in central Mexico. they amused themselves with fighting among themselves and with the Great Maya Rebellion, which was flaming over here in the eastern side of the peninsula, what's now basically the state of Quintana Roo, the war we call the Caste War, which was the most successful native rebellion in American history. It lasted 60 years or so. This next chart is what I made up to try to sort out the complicated politics of Yucatan at the time. The actual governor, the provisional governor, was Liborio Yrigoyen, a liberal Republican. He was overthrown by a conservative guy, Felipe Navarrete. This sort of thing went on a lot in those days. And Navarrete decided that Yucatan was going to be part of the empire. So they joined the empire like that without a shot being fired. And Navarrete decided that he wanted to convince Campeche to join. So he put together an army and marched down to Campeche. Mérida and Campeche have a long history of attacking each other, and surrounded the walled city. The legitimate governor, Pablo Garcia, had little choice when a French gunboat showed up offshore, and he surrendered. So all of Yucatan joined the French Empire. To get a little ahead of the story, when the empire got up and running, they brought in another guy, Jose Salazar Ilarregui, to be the commissioner for the whole peninsula, and we'll hear more about Salazar as we go on. Well, the new emperor and empress, these are their formal inaugural portraits. They said about learning the job, they diligently learned Spanish and became Maximiliano and Carlotta. One of the first duties of a royal couple, I think, is to produce heirs. But Max and Carlotta never had any children, which prompted endless speculation along obvious lines. Well, they came over in an Austrian Navy flagship, landed in Veracruz in May 1864. And I think, like many of you, I remember what the weather is like in this part of the world in May. Just about everybody who could in Veracruz had left town to go up to a more pleasant climate. It was also the height of the yellow fever season. So they didn't receive a very lavish welcome in Veracruz, but instead hit the road up to Mexico City. It was kind of an arduous journey before a railroad was built. And they arrived in Mexico City to a triumphal welcome in June 12th, 1864. Maximilian was 31 years old and Carlotta was only 24. Maximilian turned out to be more liberal than expected. I think the notables in Europe didn't do a very good job of checking out his politics. The Catholic Church favored the French. They wanted the anti-clerical reform laws rolled back, but Maximilian didn't give them much help. He turned out to be a secularist. And true to his credit, he left most of the reform laws in place. I think he had a genuine desire to help people. He just wasn't terribly good at it. Policy and governing was not his forte. He was much more concerned about ceremonies and court protocol and titles and symbols and such. This is the flag of the empire, which Maximilian reportedly helped design. A little too busy for my taste. And this is the imperial crown and scepter that were also important symbols that he liked. Carlotta was better at governing anyway, and she did that a lot while Maximilian was away for various purposes. Maximilian liked to amuse himself by wearing a charro costume and walking the streets of Mexico City, which I guess showed he was an ex-Mexican. He also had numerous affairs. He fathered a child with the daughter of a gardener in Cuernavaca. None of this can be confirmed, of course, but the story seems to hold together. The child's name was Julio Sedano. He was the right age, always claimed to be Maximilian's son, and apparently had a very strong physical resemblance to the emperor. He shows up as a minor character in history several times. For example, when the great Nicaraguan poet Rubén Darío had a diplomatic post in Paris, Sedano was his secretary. During the First World War, he was convicted of spying for Germany and executed by the French. Here's Max in his charro costume. The empire sent an imperial commissioner to Yucatán, Jose Salazar Ilarregui. He was an honest, conscientious man, but his training was as a surveyor and a mining engineer. He had no experience in governing. The Yucatán elite supported him, thought the foreign dictatorship would be free peace and order, and Salazar succeeded in tamping down the local squabbles that seemed to be characteristic of Yucatán at the time. The conservatives hailed 1865 as the beginning of a golden age, and Salazar initiated an ambitious program of public works, building schools, digging wells. He founded a bank and set up an observatory. The wealthy took advantage of their political ascendancy to enrich themselves. And in the East, the Mayan War continued. An interesting little side story, an effect of Yucatán being part of the empire was the arrival of the German immigrants. Maximilian Carlotta and the French in general had a very low opinion of Mexican people, and they decided the best way to regenerate the country was to bring in as many European immigrants as they could. So in 1865 and 66, 443 German colonists arrived in Yucatán. This is a photograph of a few of them, a contemporary photograph. They were set up in a government-financed agricultural colony near a town near Santa Elena, about 60 miles south of here. It was called Villa Carlotta. It had no chance of success. Fell apart instantly when the empire collapsed. A lot of the immigrants went back to Germany. A few came to Mérida, and I'm told that there are some German names in Mérida still that trace to that era. Some of them stayed around Santa Elena, and I'm told that you can find local residents there with blonde hair and blue eyes. What really brought Yucatán into the empire was the visit by the Empress in late 1865 that lasted a month. This is an actual photograph of Carlotta from about this time, so we can see what she really looked like without the flattery of the portrait painters.
Still.
Maximilian had intended to go to Yucatán himself, but his position in the capital was so shaky that he decided he better not go. Yucatán was key to a plan that Maximilian had to extend Mexican power into Central America. He sent representatives to Guatemala and Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua to convince them to enter into some kind of protectorate relationship with Yucatan. His image was that the expanded great Mexican empire would be the power in the middle part of America, the United States was the power in the north, and Brazil in the south. So this was his grand vision. So it was very important to him. All of this expansion would have to come out of Yucatan and move down to the south. So it was very important to have Yucatan being loyal and strongly on his side. Of course, first he had to settle a little problem with Maya, reach some kind of arrangement with the British and British Honduras and down here on the Mosquito Coast, where they were also had a presence. So Carlotta's assignment on the trip here was to build allegiance and buy support and maybe even win affection of the elite in Yucatan. And I think in that she largely succeeded, at least in the short term. Yucatan was a poor backward state. This was before the great wealth of the Atlantic, which was just in its very earliest stages. It had much effect yet, and of course nobody could have predicted that was coming. This is a map prepared by under the direction of Salazar, who after all was a surveyor. This is the earliest map of the city of Mérida that we know of. It's physically very large, so I know we can't see many details on this, but I think it's interesting to consider just a little bit of orientation. Here's the central plaza, and this is the fortress of San Benito, which we'll talk about more later. The black part here is the actual built up part of the city. It extended from Santiago in the west over to Mérida in the east, and Santa Ana way up here in the north, and the Ermita de Santa Isabel in the south were way out in the country. The population was 25,000. And all of this surrounding land here was agricultural land, and the milpas and traditional pole and thatch houses of the Maya people. Of that 23,000, the Maya were in a considerable majority. So you can see that the people of European and mestizo heritage and African heritage were black. It was a pretty small number. This was a small town. Well, Carlotta dazzled Mérida. She arrived after a difficult 2-day journey down from Veracruz and landed at Sisal on November 22nd to an enthusiastic welcome. She traveled in this carriage. It's a gilded landau manufactured in the United States. It was later used by Mexican presidents, and it's now in a museum. Still exists.
Every time he fiddled with the photos.
After an overnight in Hunagua, she entered Mérida at the western edge, the highway, the road down from Sisal at the Santiago Plaza, where a floral arch had been erected. The story is that as she traveled through the streets, enthusiastic young men unharnessed the horses and pulled the carriage themselves. She traveled down streets lined with cheering, flag-waving crowds. There was a 101 gun salute. All the bells were ringing. There were 64 triumphal arches erected over the streets, and she traveled to the cathedral for a religious service, which doubtless was packed. In Mérida, Carlotta established residence in this house, a building that still exists. It's at the corner called El Gallito. If you're standing in the main plaza facing the Mateo house, this is the corner on the left. It's now a shoe store and a pharmacy. This house has an interesting history. The whole block was owned by the descendants of Francisco de Montejo, the conquistador, for centuries. This house was built about 1750 by Juliana Solis, who was a 6th or 7th generation descendant of Montejo. And it was acquired in 1847 by Don Dario Galera. He was a wealthy merchant and landowner, member of a family that had become wealthy in the dyewood trade, longwood, tinte trade. So in 1865, after Galera and his wife had done extensive architectural remodeling and furnished it lavishly, this was one of the finest houses in the city. So Carlotta was installed here, and she described this in letters in her diary. She was a prolific letter writer. She described her view, which perhaps we can relate to a little bit. She wrote this: arriving at the house where I was lodged, I had in front of me the incomparable view of the square with this brilliant building surrounded by arcades. At the back are large palm trees, and in the middle, crossed by white sidewalks, an exquisite garden whose green lawns are divided from the rest by elegant iron railings. Carlotta was subjected to a whirlwind of lavish balls and luncheons, banquets, speeches, concerts, dances, and opera performance. And she was taken on tours of the schools, markets, the hospital, the prison, the fortress, convents, haciendas, an exhibit of Yucatecan products. There were huge fiestas and fireworks over the square in the evening. All the while, Carlotta was handing out medals, titles, gold watches, and cash. Carlotta departed Mérida for Campeche on December 5th, visiting Uxmal along the way, one of the earliest tourists to do that. It seemed like she would have visited the German colony at Villa Carlotta, but I can't find any record that she did that. She arrived in Campeche on December 11th, where the citizens made every effort to outdo Mérida. Then moved on, made another stop at Carmen, Citadel of Carmen, and then back to Veracruz and up the hill to Mexico City, doubtless exhausted. Carlotta seems to have been pretty well impressed by Yucatan, especially the archaeological sites. She was shocked by the treatment of the local Maya people. She complained of the tropical heat, although her elaborate silk costumes may not have been most appropriate for the climate. She didn't like the food very much, according to letters. She particularly mentioned a dessert made with zapotes, which she described as revolting. So anyway, there was a temporary surge in the empire's popularity, but the problems wouldn't go away. The Maya War continued, and Salazar was having increasing problems recruiting and keeping troops. Expenses were out of hand to support the military and Salazar's public works and bureaucracy, and there was a stubborn action of tax refusal among the population, so the treasury got emptied, and when he was unable to pay the teachers or the other state employees, there were mass resignations. That seemed to be a kind of a general sense of failure. A very important event at this time was that the Civil War ended in the United States. So the US was able to support the Juarez government, and President Johnson made large cash loans to Juarez and shipped large amounts of weapons. As you can imagine, there were a lot of arms left over after the Civil War ended. Anyway, the whole venture was beginning to lose popularity in France, and the US exerted diplomatic pressure on France to withdraw its support. So in spring 1866, both France and Austria withdrew financial and military support from the empire. Maximilian was ineffective and couldn't stand on his own, and the empire started coming apart. In Yucatán, disorganized gangs of draft resistors and bandits began forming in the countryside, and armed insurrection began. This whole town up here, Baca, it's near Motul. It was led by a man called Buenaventura Martinez, who I think deserves to be better known in Yucatán. The Imperial Army reached a turning point when they lost a decisive battle at Teosupo down here to the Maya. So they kind of lost all credibility and their strength dropped off. Entire units began going over to the Martinez Rebellion, and other fighting sprang up around the peninsula. An army began advancing out of Tabasco down here. Tabasco had never been taken by the French. Advancing north toward Campeche was headed by Pablo Garcia, the legitimate governor of Campeche, and he surrounded the whole city and began a siege.
About the French, Maximilian trying to control the
In
Yucatán.
January 1867, the scattered Republican forces in Yucatán accepted Manuel Cepeda Peraza as their overall commander. He was a respected veteran of the Maya reform and French wars, and he came back from exile to take command of the rebel forces. He joined the forces at Calquini and pretty quickly forced Salazar's people back into Mérida, which is here. Salazar had hoped to get reinforcements from what was left of the Imperial Army in the east. There were still some troops left in Valladolid and Peto and Tecash, but Cepeda Peraza swung around to the east and met them in a battle at Izamal and defeated them. So Salazar wasn't going to get any help. In central, let's see, where do I want to go next? So he began a siege of Mérida, which lasted 56 days. This is the central part of that big map I showed you. Again, for orientation, here's the central square of San Benito Fortress. Cepeda Peraza came back from his battle in the east and occupied the Mejorada neighborhood, San Cristobal, Ermita, San Juan, Santiago. And to complete the encirclement, there was a big battle at Santa Ana Plaza. It's so strange to me to hear of these familiar places that we know and are peaceful today, the scenes of violent battles. But I guess that's the way it isn't anymore.
Oh, so sure.
So there was a whole series. This was a serious situation. There was a pitched battle, house to house fighting. Both sides had heavy losses, more than 500 dead. And of course, Salazar held up in the fortress of San Benito. This fortress began in the 1500s as a monastery on top of the base of a Mayan pyramid. They, of course, tore down the pyramid, used the stones to build the Spanish buildings. It was gradually militarized and surrounded by walls. It became a fortress, a citadel. This is a photograph from about 1900 after the walls had been taken down. The government began dismantling the thing in about 1870, a process that took well into the 20th century. This was a big job. But you can still see the base of the Maya pyramid here. This was located where the big public markets are now, the Lucas de Galvez and San Benito markets. And for orientation, you can see obviously the cathedral over here. This is the old post office. So this is where the markets were, more or less. They took all this down and used the stones to pave the streets. In central Mexico, deprived of the French support.
No, you can't hear it at all, but it'll come
They
back.
departed, went back to Europe
Yeah,
to seek allies and support. Unsuccessfully, it turned out. Maximilian had a chance to abdicate and leave, and he vacillated over that decision, but finally decided to stand with his supporters. He the battle, and here is Maximilian on his white horse, and he led what was left of his army to a retreat to the city of Querétaro. So on the 5th anniversary of the Cinco de Mayo battle, Maximilian's entire empire consisted of the center of 3 cities, Querétaro, Campeche, and Mérida. This is a timeline of the final collapse. The siege of Querétaro lasted 70 days and was helped along by a traitor who essentially opened the gate, and Maximilian was captured. The siege of Campeche, behind those thick walls, lasted 155 days, over 5 months. Finally surrendered on June 10th. In the siege of Mérida, of course, Salazar was held up in the fortress, and Cepeda Barraza cleverly sent him a bundle of newspapers from around the country that convinced him that no help was coming. So he finally surrendered on June 15th. And as you can see, during this 5-day period, the center of Mérida was the last bit of the empire in existence. 4 days later, Maximilian and 2 of his Mexican generals were escorted to the center of his campanas in Querétaro and faced a firing squad. His empire had collapsed after only 3 years. Carlotta, back in Europe, suffered a tragic mental breakdown and spent the rest of her life in seclusion in this castle in Belgium. It still exists. It's on the northern outskirts of Brussels. All right, wait. The castle of Bouchou, or I guess it should probably be Bouchau, since it's in Flemish Brabant. During World War I, when the German army swept across Belgium, they carefully avoided this castle because, after all, Carlotta was still an Austrian archduchess. This is a rare photograph of Carlotta near Charlotte near the end of her life. She was a widow for 60 years. She died in 1927 at the age of 86. In the restored republic, Manuel Cepeda Barraza became the governor of Yucatán, probably the best one they'd ever had. Among the institutions he established that still exist are the Central Library, which bears his name, an Archaeology and History Museum, a Teachers College, and a literary institute that turned out to be the antecedent for the Autonomous University of Yucatán, Wadi. Tragically, he died of tuberculosis in March 1869. He was 41 years old. This was the last serious attempt by conservatives to restore the old order in Mexico, and the last effort of a European power to take territory in America. But Cepeda Barraza's early death and the death of Benito Juárez 3 years later left the power of a vacuum, and problems continued. another story, another series of stories. In talking about history, I like to find things that we can see today that relate to that period, that remind me of the period, and here are a few of them. Campeche has a statue of Pablo Garcia that's at the entrance to the city on the highway down from Mérida. Manuel Cepeda Peraza was clearly the hero of Yucatán in this period. This is a statue of the general dedicated by the city in 1897, which I'm sure you've seen. It's in the Parque Hidalgo. There's usually a pigeon sitting on his head. There's also a statue in Mexico City on the Paseo de la Reforma. The plaque on his face describes him as a brave and distinguished soldier, fought for the liberal cause, governed his fate with talent and patriotism. And this is the statue. Rather a nice one, I think. So this is probably a good place to stop with a relatively upbeat, heroic image of what was kind of a tragic period overall. Before I end, I'm required to give a brief commercial message. This talk is based on one of the chapters in this book, History of Yucatán, which is available for your consideration, table back there. So I would be happy to entertain any questions or comments at this point. And the Zoom viewers, you're welcome to unmute your mics and join in.
I would just ask about them to repeat the question or summarize the question.
I will, certainly, yes. Questions, comments? Surely I didn't get everything right. I know we have some real historians here. I am not a historian, just a writer, a scribbler. Yes, ma'am.
I was thinking about what we can remember about the empire here. Can you hear me?
Not really.
I'm on here and take my mask off. Okay, I'm sorry. I was thinking about what remains from the empire in terms of what can be recognized in the streets. And one thing that's really important is actually the names of the streets. That was done by the Comisión Científica, the National.
Were the fortress ones? No, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the whole names of the streets that we have in the city today,
The name?
the names, yeah, Calle 15, 20, whatever.
Yes, yes.
That comes from the time of the empire. That was done by the scientific commission.
Okay, thank you for that comment.
Yeah, that was done, that was actually organized by Salazar y Larrey.
Yes, the streets
The
in
street names,
the streets in Mérida have a very regular numbering system, which replaced a rather chaotic system of naming the street corners.
yeah.
And that comes from the imperial, the scientific planners and surveyors of the empire period. Thank you for that.
There was no civil rights in Mexico before,
Mhm.
and that came to the empire.
The civil,
The civil rights.
okay,
Yeah, before you have to take your babies or your registrations were done at the church. Or exclusively at the church.
okay.
right?
So
And that was the empire.
there were some surprisingly liberal laws that were enacted to the surprise of the conservatives who had selected Maximilian. So,
And to your question, whether Carlota could have visited Carlota, no, she didn't. I'm Alma Grant, I wrote the book.
oh,
Yeah, so, no, she didn't. And there's a very simple reason why she didn't visit. Because the colony was actually doing pretty bad,
yes,
and they were already terrible. There
They-
was already a process of
they
disintegration.
had already collapsed.
It collapsed at 67. And actually, some of the men who came to be part of that colony, the Germans, fought with Salazar y Larrey until the end, until the siege of Mérida.
Okay, you are Elma, right?
Right?
This is a woman who spent years studying the history of the Germans in Yucatan. Thank you for your observation.
So some of them were able to leave.
Some of them are,
Salazar y Larrey negotiated
That's very interesting. Thank you for your comments. Yeah, that's great.
One of the, participants asked how well Carlotta lived.
Bob, I just want to make 2 comments. This is Marilyn
I apologize.
on
I
the
don't
Zoom
hear-
program. And your sound faded in and out
Carlotta
continually.
was here, the whole journey took a month. She was here a couple of weeks, I think. I don't remember exactly. But I had the dates in here, but Jorge. Yes.
First, he brought Yucatán telegraph.
Yes, yes.
Now it's.
Yeah, they built the telegraph. The house, the house on the square connected to the first telegraph in Yucatan, connected the port of Sisal at the time Carlotta visited. And that.
The first bank opened in Yucatán, el Banco de Amélie.
The owner of that house where Carlotta stayed, Dario Galera, is also famous for introducing ice to Mérida, by the way. So that house was later a cigar factory and a grocery store and a bunch of other things before it became the shoe store that it is today. It has, if you go into the store, there are actually some interesting architectural flourishes that still exist that are reminders of that period, that when it was a beautiful house. Another trace that we can see today, the streets in the central part of Mérida are all very regular, laid out in a grid. But if you head down the street that goes to the public markets down there, it takes a big dog leg. And it does that because that's where the fortress was. It had to dodge that.
It was also the first one to actually smooth the streets in downtown Mérida. Before him, we pulled down